So let's look at some of the key changes that we're going to look at today. Firstly, the NPO Act, which I think is quite important. Trust Property Control Act. Also, a lot of organizations are registered as trust. And then the Companies Act. And then also we're going to look at the Income Tax Act and the Promotion of Access to Information Act. So those are some of the key changes that have occurred within the last couple of years that are quite important for non-profit organizations. So key questions that we have to ask is, what has changed? What must be done by the organization? Are there any available resources, for the organization? And what are the consequences of non-compliance? So I've alluded to this article that I wrote, which is volume 71 of NPO Legal Issues. It's available on our website. And it basically covers a judgment that came out in October 2022. Now, what has happened in that context is that, very briefly, a church that was registered in terms of the Non-Profit Organizations Act, and it was, maybe just some context, it was this judgment came out in 2022, which was shortly after our experience with COVID. And one of the complaints that was lodged against this church that was apparently incorporated as a company was that it didn't convene the annual general meeting as required in its founding document. Now, there's a bit of confusion because it talks about a constitution as well. And apparently it was set up as a voluntary association initially, but the Department of Social Development, or the NPO Directorate, got involved and also issued a notice of compliance to say, look, you're non-compliant, and a couple of steps were listed. And eventually an AGM was convened, and at the AGM a new board was now elected. So the old board then decided to take the matter to court and said that essentially there was no compliance with the existing founding document or the MOI, and the request was for the board to annul that AGM and to reinstate the previous board. So the newly appointed board then contested that, and the court had to now consider whether or not the new board members were actually appointed in terms of its founding documents. So there's that part of the dispute, but interestingly enough, for our purposes, the court then had to make some findings about the notice that was sent out by the NPO Directorate. So one of the findings was that the NPO Directorate was actually compelled, if there are instances of non-compliance, to issue a compliance notice to an organization that is registered. Now, at the time, the court said there was no obligation on organizations to register, but once they registered, they must comply with the provisions. And if they're non-compliant, then the obligation is on the NPO Directorate to actually continue with issuing a non-compliance notice. The NPO Directorate also made a couple of issued a couple of directives, and the court was saying, look, as the NPO Director or the Director for NPOs, your only remedy is basically to deregister the organization. And if the organization had any other benefits linked to registration, which is something the NPO Act allows for, in that context, the organization would basically lose its benefits. So a lot of organizations get funding from the department, but they could potentially lose their benefits. Now, the court said the NPO Directorate had no power to issue any of those other directives that got issued, like convening the AGM. And, the ultimate judgment or the ultimate order was that the directors were lawfully appointed, and the court said it cannot condone non-compliance on the part of the previous board, and that application to annul the AGM was effectively unsuccessful, but the counter application was approved. Now, that judgment is important because the NPO Act has been amended, and additional powers have now been given to the NPO Directorate to deal with non-compliant organizations. Also, it's not voluntary anymore. There is an aspect of compulsory registration. So let's look at these changes. And in particular, I want to just focus on some of the aspects of the amendments that were not really focused on, in terms of when we look at amendments that were made to the Act. So those are the key changes, right? The objects of the Act have changed, and that essentially is to introduce compulsory registration for some organizations. The functions of the directorate has changed because now the directorate has now to deal with this issue of compulsory registration, and also an additional, powers in terms of administrative sanctions, the requirements of registration in terms of Section 12, and also there's some changes when organizations apply to be registered. Now, it also refers to the cancellation of registration and the updated register. And there's a new Chapter 3, capital A, which introduces Section 25, capital A, that deals with eligibility requirements for non-profit organizations. And there's also a list of offenses. So let's look at it in a bit more detail. Objects. Now, key change here is the fact that the NPO Act now no longer just provides for voluntary registration, actually provides for organizations that are required to be registered. Now, this is quite important because let's suppose you deal with a situation when organization is actually required to be registered, but it has not complied with its obligations, reporting obligations in terms of the NPO Act. So previously, the remedy was to cancel the registration status of the organization, right? That is what that court judgment referred to. But at this moment, it's not so straightforward, because if you're required to be registered, but you're not compliant, then the NPO directorate cannot, or the NPO director, I must say, cannot just cancel your registration, because it wouldn't make sense if you actually require in terms of legislation to be registered. So in this context now, it introduces other remedies to deal with, a situation like that. So the functions of the directorate, very important. In order to promote the achievements of the objects of the Act and to perform its functions and duties, the directorate may collaborate, cooperate, coordinate, and enter into arrangements with other organs of state. Now, this is something that hasn't really been focused on. Essentially, the mandate of the NPO directorate has now been expanded. So, what does it mean? It means, in the past, if, let's say, the NPO directorate would contact the organization, you would know that for the most part, it is the NPO directorate that you're dealing with. At this moment, because there's been a lot of developments, the need for coordination was identified. And so, for example, if the Financial Intelligence Center or South African Police Service or any other law enforcement institution that's identified may want further information from a particular organization, they could approach the NPO directorate and say, look, we need this kind of information. Now, the NPO directorate will then engage with the organization, but actually it's the other institution that is engaging with the organization. So from that perspective, there's been a lot of attention and focus on non-profit organizations. So by implication, It's no longer just one institution that non-profits are dealing with. So the functions of the directorate may include measures to coordinate the approach to performing their functions in terms of legislation. I was actually at a meeting with the NPO directorate or the department at some point, and they were saying, but that's exactly what is happening. Other institutions would now, where appropriate, also engage with the NPO directorate in terms of obtaining information. And it's no secret, it's in the legislation. So even when we look at the NPO or the NPO risk assessment, it talks about that cross-pollination in terms of information. So those functions now may include the sharing of information between organs of state, cooperation between parties and assisting each other in performance of their respective duties in terms of legislation, and the delegation by the directorate to another organ of state of specified administrative functions.